Mga kapatid, pagbati sa pangalan ng ating Panginoong Heso Kristo. According to my record, I have been dealing with the issue of sin since our lesson number 7 on Christian holiness until last week, which was lesson number 45. Now that I think is about comprehensive sa pagbagamat hindi natin tatalakay talaga lahat ng uri ng kasalanan na maaari nating harapin, gayon man sana'y nabigyan tayo ng prinsipyo na magbibigay ng paraan para malabanan natin ang anumang kasalanan na nilalabanan natin. Ngunit panahon na mag-umpisa ng panibagong paksa sa ating serye ng Christian Holiness, and it is about the standard of holiness. Bakit kailangan ng isang standard o pamantayan ng kabanalan? This is so necessary because without a standard, we cannot define sin or holiness. Sa mga pinag-aralan natin ng mga kasalanan at kung paano maging banal ay kinakailangan na alam natin ang pamantayan. At ano ang ating magiging pamantayan? Well, I start with the negative. It cannot be just the individual conscience. Hindi lang kung anong inaakalang tama ng iyong konsensya. Mahalaga man ang konsensya. There was a state or condition of Israel in its stage of history na sinabi ang ganito sa Judges 21 verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. At ganyan ang mangyayari kapag ang tama lang ay kung ano ang nasa paningin mo sa halip na may pamantayang sumasaklaw para sa lahat. In other words, personal conviction alone leads to anarchy. At pansinin yung sinabi, there was no king in Israel, which was the cause of such anarchy, which tells us there is a need for a governing rule. May dapat na namamahala. And just as we do not accept just individual conscience, also not moral majority. I put it in quotation dahil moral majority used to be a popular political movement in the United States, but this refers to the idea that the majority sets the rule. At ang kung anong sabihin ng mayorya na tama o mali ay yun ang sinusunod. In other words, the norm. But there is a basic distinction between the norm as understood by humanistic ethic and the norm as understood by the biblical ethic. So what should be the norm? In humanistic ethic, the norm is the normal. At ang sinasabi nating normal ay what is acceptable to the majority. Kaya kung katanggap-tanggap sa nakararami, para sa kanila normal na yan, and that is their norm. But this is in contrast with the biblical ethic, which sees the norm as that which is normative. Kahit pa normal yan, ngunit kung lumalabag sa pamantayan ng Diyos, yan ay hindi katanggap-tanggap na pamantayan. To make it normative, it must be imperative to all mankind. Hindi lang sa isang kultura, hindi lamang sa isang individual, ngunit ito ay pangkalahatan. So that brings us to the issue of what should be the standards of holiness. Well, the answer to that, as we have studied early in this series on Christian holiness, God Himself is the Holy One, and therefore God Himself is the supreme standard. Sinabi ni Peter, quoting from Leviticus 19, but just as He who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do, for it is written, be holy because I am holy. Kaya ang talagang sinusundan natin na kabanalan ay ang pagkabanal ng Diyos. But that really doesn't answer the question as to what the standard is, because anybody can say his idea of God's holiness, again, by his own thinking. Kaya't hindi iniwan ng kasulatan sa atin para sabihin kung ano ang kabanalan ng Diyos. Kaya sa ating pag-aaralang standards of holiness, may apat tayong titingnan. Ang una ay ang Ten Commandments o ang 10 utos. Ang ikalawa ay ang Kingdom of Christ o ang kaharian ni Kristo. Ang ikatlo ay ang Example of Jesus o ang huwaran o halimbawa ni Jesus. At ang ikaapat ay Fruit of the Spirit o bunga ng Espiritu. Kaya magsimula tayo sa 10 utos o sa isang salita ay the Decalogue. The Decalogue simply means 10 words, or oftentimes the word used is the law. But the law can be used with a wide range of meaning. Sa kasulatan, it can denote in fact the whole of the scriptures or the Old Testament, and in particular that part of the Old Testament written by Moses, the first 5 books which we call the Pentateuch, or it can refer to the whole Mosaic law, including the ceremonial laws, the civil laws for the nation of Israel, as well as the moral laws. Why are we concentrating on the Ten Commandments or the Decalogue? Because according to the Old Testament itself, the Decalogue is summary of God's covenant with Israel. God's covenant with Israel has a wide spectrum. Pero nang ito'y bigyang buod, sinabi ng Deuteronomy 4 and verse 13, He declared to you His covenant, which He commanded you to perform, even 10 commandments, and He wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. So the covenant, which is multifaceted, yet in summary, can point to the 10 commandments. At pagdating sa pagbubuod ng moralidad na dapat na pamantayan ng tao, isa sa pinakamagandang pagbuod ay ang 10 utos. Therefore, the Decalogue is the most important summary of God's moral standard. In fact, in the way we define sin, we go back to the 10 Commandments. And the Apostle Paul universally applies the law to all of mankind to expose the sinfulness of all mankind, that's Jews and Gentiles alike. So it defines the world's sinfulness, as Paul says in Romans 3, that all the world may become guilty before God. So it's not just for Israel, but all the world becomes guilty. That is, they are exposed to be guilty because of their transgression of the law. And so Paul concludes, therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. So, sa pamamagitan ng kautusan natin nalalaman kung ano ang kasalanan. Kaya isip-isipin natin ang kahalagahan ng 10 utos. Minsan binabaliwala ito ng mga hindi pinag-iisipan ang kahalagahan ng 10 utos. Consider that the Decalogue or the 10 Commandments are the only material in all of the scriptures written by God Himself. Kung mahalaga sa iyo ang isang tao, pahalagahan mo ang kanyang mga isinulat. Lalo pat kung may kaunti lamang siyang isinulat na siya mismo ang nagsulat. At pagdating sa mga bagay na isinulat ng Diyos, tanging ang 10 utos mismo ang siya ang nagsulat. At sinabi ito sa Exodus 31:18 na He gave to Moses when he had finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone written with the finger of God. Sinulat mismo sa 2 lapida ng bato ang mga utos ng Diyos na siya mismo ang nagsulat. Alam natin, ito ay binasag ni Moises dahil sa kasalanan ng Israel, ngunit muli ang Diyos pa rin ang lumikha ng panibagong pagsusulat at siya pa rin ang nagsulat. Sabi ng Deuteronomy 5:22, These words the Lord spoke to all your assembly at the mountain from the midst of the fire, of the cloud and of the thick gloom with a great voice, and He added no more. He wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. So these are the words of Moses, at sinasabi niya na ang Diyos mismo ang nagsulat ng 10 utos. Kung galing mismo sa pagsusulat ng Diyos, hindi ito maaring baliwalain. At pagdating sa ating Panginoong Hesus, nang siya'y hamunin kung anong pinakamahalagang kautusan, He summarized the greatest commandments in terms of the 2 tablets of the Decalogue. Remember, ang sinabi niya sa Matthew 22, I love the Lord your God with all your heart, and then the second is love your neighbor as yourself. These are the commandments that summarize the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. And Jesus concluded, all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. Sa 2 utos na yon o sa 2 lapida ng bato na kumakatawan sa 10 utos. Kaya isipin natin, may pamamahala ba ang 10 utos sa atin hanggang ngayon? Is there a binding authority of the Decalogue? There are some Christians who deny the Decalogue's binding authority. At may iba't iba silang kadahilanan. Ang pinakamadalas ay una, sinasabi nila it was for the Old Testament and now replaced by the law of Jesus. Parang lumang tipan yan, o sinasabi nila ay pang Israel at hindi na para sa atin na ang sinusundan na ay ang Panginoong Hesus. Ang may sasagot natin yan ay sabihin lang na Christ Himself appealed to the law. There will be a time in a future lesson that we will study more deeply the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 to 7. But what is the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus is explaining the standard of the Ten Commandments in a way that shows His kingdom na pag-aaralan din natin. Pero hindi siya lumayo sa aplikasyon ng 10 utos para sa mga mananampalataya at sa mga tagasunod niya. At hindi lamang si Kristo ang maging mga apostol ay umapila din sa 10 utos. We can only use one example in the case of the Apostle Paul when he told children in his letter to the Ephesians, "Children, obey your parents because this is right." And then he attached to this, sinabi niya, "Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise." Ano ibig sabihin niyang the first commandment with promise? Ang tinutukoy niya ay ang 10 utos. Of the 10 commandments, the first one with an attached promise is the 5th commandment, which is about honoring your father and mother. Sa mga tuwid, Jesus appealed to the 10 commandments. The apostles appealed to the 10 commandments. Hindi pwedeng sabihin na panlumang tipan lamang yan at hindi na pang bagong tipan. So, isang idinadahilan din ay we are under grace. At ang iba naman ang sasabihin, we are now motivated by love. And so they are using grace or love to say that we are not under the law. Well, unahin ko itong sinasabing grace. It is true, we are saved by grace, but it has always been the case. Even before Christ, salvation was by grace through promise. When Christ came, salvation is by grace through the fulfillment of Christ, but it's always been by grace. But grace in Christ does not abrogate the law. Apostle Paul makes that very clear. Grace instead establishes the law by faith. Ang kanyang hamon, do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. So this is one of those by no means statements of the Apostle Paul. On the contrary, we establish the law. Tinataguyod natin ang kautusan. So instead of grace abrogating the law, grace establishes the law. What about love? Well, love is both. Love is motive and law is directive, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Hindi pinagsasalungat ang pag-ibig at ang pag-uutos. Hindi mo pwede sabihin kapag umiiral sa iyo ang pag-ibig ay walang pag-uutos na umiiral, o kung ikaw ay nasa pag-uutos, wala kang pag-ibig. Pareho sa lumang tipan at sa bagong tipan, ang motibo ay pag-ibig. Pero kapag ang motibo mo ay pag-ibig, ang motibong yan ay susunod sa kautusan. So there must be both love and law. Apostle Paul makes that clear in Romans 13. For this, at he quotes some of the commandments of the 10 commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Love therefore is the fulfillment of the laws. Kaya love and law are partners. Hindi sila magkahiwalay. Sabi nga ng isang Puritan, love is the heart of the law. Without love, law is dead. And law is the eye of love. Without law, love is blind. Magkasama ang love at ang law. Kaya to discard the law leaves us no fundamental definition of sin and holiness. Malaking kawalan na tanggalin natin ang 10 utos ng Diyos. Pero saan ba naaangkop ang 10 utos? So we now deal with the comprehensive application of the Decalogue. May mga nag-aakala, they object to the Decalogue because they think that makes morality very narrow. Parang sinasabi nila, 10 lang. Are there just 10 issues of morality? Now, this is born of misunderstanding the commandments as pertaining only to action. Akala nila ay yung talagang mismong pinagbabawal lang na gawin o yung pinag-uutos na gawin, and that is a misunderstanding. In fact, there is at least one commandment in the Decalogue which is clearly internal. The 10th commandment says, "You shall not covet," and that gives us a clue that the way to understand the 10 commandments is that there is an internal aspect to each of the commandments as well as there are external aspects, and when we understand that, they will not be narrow in our thinking. At makikita natin both Old Testament and New Testament use the commandments internally. Both are concerned. Huwag natin isipin na sa bagong tipan naging madiin sa panloob, samantalang ang lumang tipan ay panlabas. That is wrong. We see this in the prayer of David in Psalm 139. "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." But how do you know what is offensive? It is an offense to the law of God. So that law is, we are guilty of offense to the law internally. Lumang tipan iyan. Kaya makikita natin na hindi narrow. May dalawang prinsipyo ng pag-angkop ng 10 utos na magpapalawak ng saklaw nito. It will make the application of the law comprehensive if you remember these 2 rules. The first is positive negative rule. Ang ibig sabihin niyan, the prohibition implies the opposite prescription and vice versa. Kapag may pinagbawal, kasama dyan ang kabaligtaran na tungkulin. At kung merong pinagagawa, kasama riyan na iwasan ang kabaligtaran na kasalanan. So we see this, for example, using 2 items of the 10 commandments. "You shall not kill" implies the positive, which is respect for life. Hindi mo kinakailangan talagang kumitil ng buhay. If there is disrespect of persons, that is a violation of the command, "You shall not murder." We see this in the way James applies. In James chapter 2, he is indicting some people in the church for showing respect to the rich man who visited the congregation and then disrespected the poor who visited the same congregation, and their partiality is a transgression of the command. Which command? Well, he says, if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles in one point, he has become guilty of all. For he who said, "Do not commit adultery," also said, "Do not commit murder." Now, if you do not commit adultery but do commit murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So what law was being transgressed by their partiality for the rich against the poor? And sabi ni James, the commandment, "Do not murder." So therefore, respect for life is implied by the command, "You shall not murder." And tingnan natin, "You shall not steal" implies that you must have honest living and giving. Kung ang pagnanakaw ay pagkuha ng hindi sa iyo, ang kabaligtaran niyan ay magkaroon ka ng hanap buhay na matapat at pagkatapos gamitin mo ang sa iyo para ibigay sa iba. This is clearly the way Paul applies this in Ephesians 4:28. "Let the thief no longer steal but Rather, let him labor doing honest work with his own hands so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. So there you have the positive negative rule, which shows that the commandments are not narrow as considered by some. They are in fact wide, comprehensive in application if we understand the positive negative rule. At ito'y umaangkop sa ating napag-aralan tungkol sa kasalanan. Ano ba ang kasalanan? Diba napag-aralan natin, sin is both sin of commission and sin of omission. Ang kasalanan ay hindi lang ang nagagawa mo o nalalabag mong utos, kundi kapag may mabuti na hindi mo ginawa. Maliwanag ito sa James 4:17. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Holiness, therefore, is always positive and negative. This is clear in 2 Corinthians 7:1. Having therefore these promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves, the negative, from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God, the positive. So you have both positive and negative in the pursuit of holiness. Ang ikalawang rule ay the active motive rule. Ang ibig sabihin niyan, every command covers all that lead to the violation of the command, as well as the motives and thoughts behind that violation. Makikita uli natin ito sa utos, you shall not kill, will include the motive or attitude of hate. Maliwanag ito sa sinabi ni Jesus sa Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment, and whoever says to his brother Rakah shall be in danger of the council, but whoever says you fool shall be in danger of hellfire. Without going into the details, ang makikita natin dyan, yung saloobin kapag napupuno ka ng puot, at yung sinasabi kapag may sinasabi kang masama laban sa iyong kapatid o kapwa, ay paglabag na ito sa utos na huwag kang papatay. At alam natin ang sinabi tungkol sa you shall not commit adultery. Jesus said in Matthew 5:28, I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So adultery is not just the act itself, but the sinful thought, the sinful sensuality of the mind is already a violation of the command. So that shows it's not just the action, but the thoughts and motivation ang isinasaklaw ng kautusan. And this is in keeping with what we learned concerning mortification. Remember, mortification begins and ends with thoughts. Kung hindi mo labanan sa isip mo yan, ay hindi ka mananaig sa kasalanan kahit pa hindi tumuloy sa aktual na panlabas na kasalanan. And that is why holiness must be understood as internal first, and then external. Maliwanag ito sa sinabi ng Panginoong Hesus in a series of woes against the scribes and Pharisees because of their hypocrisy in their being so concerned on the externals of the law. He said in Matthew 23, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, then the outside also may be clean. So it begins with the internal and then the external. And that is how to understand the Ten Commandments. And if we understand the Ten Commandments as including the motive, the thoughts, and everything that leads to what may violate the commandment, that shows that it is very comprehensive indeed in its application. So just some final thoughts. We must understand our obedience to the law as an evangelical obedience. In other words, it is obedience that is moved by our salvation by grace in the gospel. Hindi tayo sumusunod para maligtas. That's legalism. Our obedience is based on the gospel. Ang turo ng bagong tipan, we are still under the law but now oriented to Christ. When Apostle Paul was explaining his approach of evangelism to different kinds of people, he mentions a particular kind, and he says this in 1 Corinthians 9:21, to them that are without law as without law. And immediately he qualifies, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I may gain them that are without law. So sa mga nabubuhay na walang kautusan, nakikibagay siya pero hindi ibig sabihin na wala siyang kautusan. Nasa ilalim siya ng kautusan pero may kinalaman kay Hesus Kristo. Anong ibig sabihin nito? Well, let me just use two statements directly taken from the New Testament. And that first is, the law is written upon the heart. Ang sabi ng Hebrews chapter 8, citing Jeremiah 31 as fulfillment, this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. So the law is now written upon the heart as far as believers in the New Testament are concerned. What is this saying? Well, remember, the law in the Old Covenant was written upon tablets of stone. God himself wrote those laws, those commandments. Now, in the New Covenant, there will be a change of mediums. The changed medium is from tablets of stone now to the heart, which means internal. But, this is important, what is written is whatever was written on the tablets of stone. Hindi naman nagbago ang isinulat. Ang nagbago ay kung saan isinulat. Pero ang isinulat ay kung ano man ang isinulat doon sa lapida ng bato na 10 utos, ganun pa rin sa puso. It's the same law. The content of what is written is still the Decalogue. Kaya ang pagsunod ng mananampalataya ay nanggagaling na sa kanyang puso, hindi lamang dahil sa may panlabas na kautusan, kundi merong motibo na sa puso na siya ay sumunod. At ang panghuling pangungusap na sana we say amen to this is, His commandments are not burdensome. This is based on 1 John chapter 5 and verse 3. But this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not burdensome. Hindi pabigat ang kautusan ng Diyos. Hindi siya pabigat dahil hindi tayo sumusunod para maligtas. Obedience is not legalistic. That will make it a heavy burden. But we are not seeking salvation by the law. We have been saved by the gospel, by the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, and that elicits in us a response of love. And when we love God, then His commandments are not burdensome to obey. And that is why the challenge here is, let our obedience be a response of love to the grace and goodness of God. At kapag na mayani ang pag-ibig natin sa Diyos at ang pagpapahalaga natin sa kanyang biyaya at kabutihang loob sa atin, ay susunod ang pagsunod. Ganyan ang kabanalan. Kung kaya't naniniwala tayo na ang 10 utos ay nananatili na pamantayan para sa kabanalan, huwag nating isantabi. Sa halip ay panariwain natin na iniligtas tayo sa hatol ng kautusan sa pamamagitan ni Hesus Kristo, ngunit ngayon tayo nasa ilalim ng kautusan, alang-alang kay Hesus Kristo, at ganyan tayo magkakaroon ng pamantayan ng kabanalan, sumusunod sa kautusan ng Diyos. Maraming salamat sa inyong pakikinig. Sana kayo ay nakinabang at pagpalain kayo ng pag-ibig ng Diyos Ama, ng biyaya ng kanyang anak na si Hesus Kristo, at ng pakikipisan ng banal na Espiritu.